Letter from Adam Smith, LLD, to William Strahan, Esquire, Kirkcaldy, 5th Shire, November 9th, 1776. Dear Sir, it is with a real, though a very melancholy pleasure, that I sit down to give you some account of the behavior of our late excellent friend, Mr. Hume, during his last illness, though, in his own judgment, his disease was mortal and incurable. Yet he allowed himself to be prevailed upon by the entreaty of his friends to try what might be the effects of a long journey. A few days before he set out, he wrote that account of his own life, which, together with his other papers, he has left to your care. My account, therefore, shall begin where his ends. He set out for London towards the end of April, and at Morpeth met with Mr. John Home and myself, who had both come down from London on purpose to see him. Expecting to have found him at Edinburgh, Mr. Home returned with him, and attended him during the whole of his stay in England, with that care and attention which might be expected from a temper so perfectly friendly and affectionate. As I have written to my mother that she might expect me in Scotland, I was under the necessity of continuing my journey. His disease seemed to yield to exercise and change of air, and when he arrived in London he was apparently in much better health than when he left Edinburgh. He was advised to go to Bath, to drink the waters, which appeared for some time to have so good an effect upon him that even he himself began to entertain, what he was not apt to do, a better opinion of his own health. His symptoms, however, soon returned with their usual violence, and from that moment he gave up all thoughts of recovery, but submitted with the utmost cheerfulness and the most perfect complacency and resignation. Upon his return to Edinburgh, though he found himself much weaker, yet his cheerfulness never abated, and he continued to divert himself as usual with correcting his own works for a new edition, with reading books of amusement, with the conversation of his friends, and sometimes in the evening with a party at his favorite game of whist. His cheerfulness was so great, and his conversation and amusements ran so much in their usual strain, that notwithstanding all bad symptoms, many people could not believe he was dying. I shall tell you, friend, Colonel Edmonstone, said Dr. Dundas to him one day, that I left you much better and in a fair way of recovery. Doctor, said he, as I believe you would not choose to tell anything but the truth, you had better tell him that I am dying as fast as my enemies, if I have any, could wish, and as easily and cheerfully as my best friends could desire. Colonel Edmonstone soon afterwards came to see him and take leave of him, and on his way home he could not forbear writing him a letter, bidding him once more an eternal adieu, and applying to him as to a dying man the beautiful French verses, in which the Abbé Chaulieu, in expectation of his own death, laments his approaching separation from his friend the Marquis de la Fare. Mr. Hume's magnanimity and firmness were such that his most affectionate friends knew that they hazarded nothing in talking or writing to him as to a dying man, and that so far from being hurt by his frankness, he was rather pleased and flattered by it. I happened to come into his room while he was reading this letter, which he had just received, and which he immediately showed me. I told him that though I was sensible how very much he was weakened, and that appearances were in many respects very bad, yet his cheerfulness was still so great, the spirit of life seemed still to be so very strong in him, that I could not help entertaining some faint hopes. He answered, your hopes are groundless. An habitual diarrhea of more than a year's standing would be a very bad disease at any age. At my age, it is a mortal one. When I lie down in the evening, I feel myself weaker than when I rose in the morning, and when I rise in the morning, weaker than when I lay down in the evening. I am sensible, besides, that some of my vital parts are affected, so that I must soon die. Well, said I, if it must be so, you have at least the satisfaction of leaving all your friends, your brother's family in particular, in great prosperity. He said that he felt that satisfaction so sensibly that when he was reading a few days before Lucian's dialogues of the dead, among all the excuses which are alleged to Charon for not entering readily into his boat, he could not find one that fitted him. He had no house to finish. He had no daughter to provide for. He had no enemies upon whom he wished to revenge himself. I could not well imagine, said he, what excuse I could make to Charon in order to obtain a little delay. I have done everything of consequence which I ever meant to do, and I could at no time expect to leave my relations and friends in a better situation than that in which I am now likely to leave them. I therefore have all reason to die contented. He then diverted himself with inventing several jocular excuses which he supposed he might make to Charon, and with imagining the very surly answers which it might suit the character of Charon to return to them. Upon further consideration, said he, I thought I might say to him, Good Charon, I have been correcting my works for a new edition. Allow me a little time, that I may see how the public receives the alterations. But Charon would answer, When you have seen the effect of these, you will be for making other alterations. There will be no end of such excuses. So, honest friend, please step into the boat. But I might still urge, have a little patience, good Charon. I have been endeavoring to open the eyes of the public. If I live a few years longer, I may have the satisfaction of seeing the downfall of some of the prevailing systems of superstition. But Charon would then lose all temper and decency. You loitering rogue! That will not happen these many 100 years. Do you fancy I will grant you a lease for so long a term? Get into the boat this instant! You lazy loitering rogue. But though Mr. Hume always talked of his approaching dissolution with great cheerfulness, he never affected to make any parade of his magnanimity. He never mentioned the subject but when the conversation naturally led to it, and never dwelt longer upon it than the course of the conversation happened to require. It was a subject, indeed, which occurred pretty frequently in consequence of the inquiries which his friends who came to see him naturally made concerning the state of his health. The conversation which I mentioned above, and which passed on Thursday the 8th of August, was the last. Except one that I ever had with him. He had now become so very weak that the company of his most intimate friends fatigued him, for his cheerfulness was still so great, his complaisance and social disposition were still so entire, that when any friend was with him, he could not help talking more, and with greater exertion than suited the weakness of his body. At his own desire, therefore, I agreed to leave Edinburgh, where I was staying partly upon his account, and return to my mother's house here at Kirkcaldy, upon condition that he would send for me whenever he wished to see me, the physician who saw him most frequently, Dr. Black, undertaking in the meantime to write me occasionally an account of the state of his health. On the 22nd of August, the doctor wrote me the following letter. Since my last, Mr. Hume has passed his time pretty easily, but is much weaker. He sits up, goes downstairs once a day, and amuses himself with reading, but seldom sees anybody. He finds that even the conversation of his most intimate friends fatigues and oppresses him. And it is happy that he does not need it. Does not need it. For he is quite free from anxiety, impatience, or low spirits, and passes his time very well with the assistance of amusing books. I received the day after a letter from Mr. Hume himself, of which the following is an extract. Edinburgh, 23rd August, 1776. My dearest friend, I am obliged to make use of my nephew's hand in writing to you, as I do not rise today. I go very fast to decline, and last night had a small fever, which I hoped might put a quicker period to this tedious illness, but unluckily it has in a great measure gone off. I cannot submit to your coming over here on my account, as it is possible for me to see you so small a part of the day, but Dr. Black can better inform you concerning the degree of strength which may from time to time remain with me. Adieu, etc. 3 days after, I received the following letter from Dr. Black. Edinburgh, Monday, 26 August 1776. Dear Sir, yesterday about 4 o'clock afternoon Mr. Hume expired. The near approach of his death became evident in the night between Thursday and Friday, when his disease became excessive and soon weakened him so much that he could no longer rise out of his bed. He continued to the last perfectly sensible and free from much pain or feelings of distress. He never dropped the smallest expression of impatience, but when he had occasion to speak to the people about him, always did it with affection and tenderness. I thought it improper to write to bring you over, especially as I heard that he had dictated a letter to you, desiring you not to come. When he became very weak, it cost him an effort to speak, and he died in such a happy composure of mind that nothing could exceed it. Thus died our most excellent and never to be forgotten friend, concerning whose philosophical opinions men will no doubt judge variously, every one approving or condemning them according as they happen to coincide or disagree with his own, but concerning whose character and conduct there can scarce be a difference of opinion. His temper indeed seemed to be more happily balanced, if I may be allowed such an expression, than that perhaps of any other man I have ever known. Even in the lowest state of his fortune, his great and necessary frugality never hindered him from exercising, upon proper occasions, acts both of charity and generosity. It was a frugality founded not upon avarice, but upon the love of independency. The extreme gentleness of his nature never weakened either the firmness of his mind or the steadiness of his resolutions. His constant pleasantry was the genuine effusion of good nature and good humor, tempered with delicacy and modesty, and without even the slightest tincture of malignity, so frequently the disagreeable source of what is called wit in other men. It never was the meaning of his raillery to mortify, and therefore, far from offending, it seldom failed to please and delight even those who were the objects of it. To his friends, who were frequently the objects of it, there was not perhaps any one of all his great and amiable qualities which contributed more to endear his conversation, and that gaiety of temper so agreeable in society, but which is so often accompanied with frivolous and superficial qualities, was in him certainly attended with the most severe application, the most extensive learning. The greatest depth of thought, and a capacity in every respect, the most comprehensive. Upon the whole, I have always considered him both in his lifetime and since his death as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit. I ever am, dear sir, most affectionately yours, Adam Smith. History of England, Chapter 1, The Britons. The curiosity entertained by all civilized nations of inquiring into the exploits and adventures of their ancestors commonly excites a regret that the history of remote ages should always be so much involved in obscurity, uncertainty, and contradiction. Ingenious men possessed of leisure are apt to push their researches beyond the period in which literary monuments are framed or preserved, without reflecting that the history of past events is immediately lost or disfigured when entrusted to memory and oral tradition. and that the adventures of barbarous nations, even if they were recorded, could afford little or no entertainment to men born in a more cultivated age. The convulsions of a civilized state usually compose the most instructive and most interesting part of its history, but the sudden, violent, and unprepared revolutions incident to barbarians are so much guided by caprice and terminate so often in cruelty that they disgust us by the uniformity of their appearance. And it is rather fortunate for letters that they are buried in silence and oblivion. The only certain means by which nations can indulge their curiosity in researches concerning their remote origin is to consider the language, manners, and customs of their ancestors, and to compare them with those of the neighboring nations. The fables which are commonly employed to supply the place of true history ought entirely to be disregarded, or if any exception be admitted to this general rule, it can only be in favor of the ancient Grecian fictions, which are so celebrated and so agreeable that they will ever be the objects of the attention of mankind. Neglecting, therefore, all traditions, or rather tales, concerning the more early history of Britain, we shall only consider the state of the inhabitants as it appeared to the Romans on their invasion of this country. We shall briefly run over the events which attended the conquest made by that empire as belonging more to Roman than British story. We shall hasten through the obscure and uninteresting period of Saxon annals, and shall reserve a more full narration for those times when the truth is both so well ascertained and so complete as to promise entertainment and instruction to the reader. All ancient writers agree in representing the first inhabitants of Britain as a tribe of the Gauls or Celtae, who peopled that island from the neighboring continent. Their language was the same, their manners, their government, their superstition varied only by those small differences which time or a communication with the bordering nations must necessarily introduce. The inhabitants of Gaul, especially in those parts which lie contiguous to Italy, had acquired from a commerce with their southern neighbors some refinement in the arts, which gradually diffused themselves northwards and spread but a very faint light over this island. The Greek and Roman navigators or merchants, for there were scarcely any other travelers in those ages, brought back the most shocking accounts of the ferocity of the people, which they magnified, as usual, in order to excite the admiration of their countrymen. The southeast parts, however, of Britain had already, before the age of Caesar, made the first and most requisite step towards a civil settlement, and the Britons, by tillage and agriculture, had there increased to a great multitude. The other inhabitants of the island still maintained themselves by pasture. They were clothed with skins of beasts. They dwelt in huts, which they reared in the forests and marshes with which the country was covered. They shifted easily their habitation when actuated either by the hopes of plunder or the fear of an enemy. The convenience of feeding their cattle was even a sufficient motive for removing their seats. And as they were ignorant of all the refinements of life, their wants and their possessions were equally scanty and limited. The Britons were divided into many small nations or tribes, and being a military people whose sole property was their arms and their cattle. And as they were ignorant of all the refinements of life, their wants and their possessions were equally scanty and limited. The Britons were divided into many small nations or tribes, and being a military people whose sole property was their arms and their cattle. It was impossible after they had acquired a relish of liberty for their princes or chieftains to establish any despotic authority over them. Their governments, though monarchical, were free as well as those of all the Celtic nations, and the common people seem even to have enjoyed more liberty among them than among the nations of Gaul, from whom they were descended. Each state was divided into factions within itself. It was agitated with jealousy or animosity against the neighboring states, and, while the arts of peace were yet unknown, wars were the chief occupation and formed the chief object of ambition among the people. The religion of the Britons was one of the most considerable parts of their government, and the Druids, who were their priests, possessed great authority among them. Besides ministering at the altar and directing all religious duties, they presided over the education of the education of the youth. They enjoyed an immunity from wars and taxes. They possessed both the civil and criminal jurisdiction. They decided all controversies among states as well as among private persons, and whoever refused to submit to their decree was exposed to the most severe penalties. The sentence of excommunication was pronounced against him. He was forbidden access to the sacrifices or public worship. He was debarred all intercourse with his fellow citizens, even in the common affairs of life. His company was universally shunned as profane and dangerous. He was refused the protection of law, and death itself became an acceptable relief from the misery and infamy to which he was exposed. Thus the bands of government, which were naturally loose among that rude and turbulent people, were happily corroborated by the terrors of their superstition. No species of superstition was ever more terrible than that of the Druids. Besides the severe penalties, which it was in the power of the ecclesiastics to inflict in this world, they inculcated the eternal transmigration of souls, and thereby extended their authority as far as the fears of their timorous votaries. They practiced their rites in dark groves, or other secret recesses. And in order to throw a greater mystery over their religion, they communicated their doctrines only to the initiated. Only to the initiated. And strictly forbade the committing of them to writing, lest they should any time be exposed to the examination of the profane, vulgar. Human sacrifices were practiced among them. The spoils of war were often devoted to their divinities, and they punished with the severest tortures whoever dared to secrete any part of the consecrated offering. These treasures they kept in woods and forests, secured by no other guard than the terrors of their religion. The terrors of their religion. The terrors of their religion. And this steady conquest over human avidity may be regarded as more signal than their prompting men to the most extraordinary and most violent efforts. No idolatrous worship ever attains such an ascendant over mankind as that of the ancient Gauls and Britons. No idolatrous worship ever attained such an ascendant over mankind as that of the ancient Gauls and Britons, and the Romans and their conquest, finding it impossible to reconcile those nations to the laws and institutions of their masters, while it maintained its authority, were at last obliged to abolish it by penal statutes, a violence which had never in any other instance been practiced by those tolerating conquerors. The Britons had long remained in this rude but independent state, when Caesar, having overrun all Gaul by his victories, first cast his eye on their island. He was not allured either by its riches or its renown, but being ambitious of carrying the Roman arms into a new world, then mostly unknown, he took advantage of a short interval in his Gallic wars and made an invasion on Britain. The natives, informed of his intention, were sensible of the unequal contest and endeavored to appease him by submissions, which, however, retarded not the execution of his design. After some resistance, he landed, as is supposed, at Deal, Anno Ante, c. 55. And having obtained several advantages over the Britons, and obliged them to promise hostages for their future obedience, he was constrained by the necessity of his affairs and the approach of winter to withdraw his forces into Gaul. The Britons, relieved from the terror of his arms, neglected the performance of their stipulations, and that haughty conqueror resolved next summer to chastise them for their breach of treaty. He landed with a greater force, and though he found a more regular resistance from the Britons, who had united under Cassivellaunus, one of their petty princes, he discomfited them in every action. He advanced into the country past the Thames in the face of the enemy, took and burned the capital of Cassivellaunus, established his ally Mandu Bratius in the sovereignty of the Trinobantes, and having obliged the inhabitants to make him new submissions, he again returned with his army into Gaul, and left the authority of the Romans more nominal than real in this island. The civil wars which ensued, and which prepared the way for the establishment of monarchy in Rome, saved the Britons from that yoke which was ready to be imposed upon them. Augustus, the successor of Caesar, content with the victory obtained over the liberties of his own country, was little ambitious of acquiring fame by foreign wars, and being apprehensive lest the same unlimited extent of dominion which had subverted the republic might also overwhelm the empire, he recommended it to his successors never to enlarge the territories of the Romans. Tiberius, jealous of the fame which might be acquired by his generals, made this advice of Augustus a pretense for his inactivity. The mad sallies of Caligula, in which he menaced Britain with an invasion, served only to expose himself and the empire to ridicule, and the Britons had now, during almost a century, enjoyed their liberty unmolested. When the Romans in the reign of Claudius began to think seriously of reducing them under their dominion, without seeking any more justifiable reasons of hostility than were employed by the late Europeans in subjecting the Africans and Americans, they sent over an army, AD 43, under the command of Plautius, an able general who gained some victories and made a considerable progress in subduing the inhabitants. Claudius himself, finding matters sufficiently prepared for his reception, made a journey into Britain and received the submission of several British states, the Canti, Atrebates, Regni, and Trinobantes, who inhabited the southeast parts of the island, and whom their possessions and more cultivated manner of life rendered willing to purchase peace at the expense of their liberty. The other Britons, under the command of Caractacus, still maintained an obstinate resistance, and the Romans made little progress against him, till Ostorius Scapula was sent over to command their armies, AD 50. This general advanced the Roman conquest over the Britons, pierced into the country of Silures, a warlike nation who inhabited the banks of the Severn, defeated Caractacus in a great battle, took him prisoner, and sent him to Rome, where his magnanimous behavior procured him better treatment than those conquerors usually bestowed on captive princes. Notwithstanding these misfortunes, the Britons were not subdued, and this island was regarded by the ambitious Romans as a field in which military honor might still be acquired. AD 59. Under the reign of Nero, Suetonius Paulinus was invested with the command and prepared to signalize his name by victories over those barbarians. Finding that the island of Mona, now Anglesey, was the chief seat of the Druids, he resolved to attack it and to subject a place which was the center of their superstition and which afforded protection to all their baffled forces. The Britons endeavored to obstruct his landing on this sacred island, both by the force of their arms and the errors and the terrors of their religion. The women and priests were intermingled with the soldiers upon the shore, and running about with flaming torches in their hands and tossing their disheveled hair. They struck greater terror into the astonished Romans by their howlings, cries, and execrations than the real danger from the armed forces was able to inspire. But Suetonius, exhorting his troops to despise the menaces of a superstition which they despised, impelled them to the attack, drove the Britons off the field, burned the Druids. Burned the Druids in the same fires which those priests had prepared for their captive enemies, destroyed all the consecrated groves, and altars, and having thus triumphed over the religion of the Britons, he thought his future progress would be easy in reducing the people to subjection, but he was disappointed in his expectations. The Britons, taking advantage of his absence, were all in arms and headed by Boudicca, queen of the Iceni, who had been treated in the most ignominious manner by the Roman tribunes, had already attacked with success several settlements of their insulting conquerors. Suetonius hastened to the protection of London, which was already a flourishing Roman colony. But found on his arrival that it would be requisite for the general safety to abandon that place to the merciless fury of the enemy. London was reduced to ashes. Such of the inhabitants as remained in it were cruelly massacred. The Romans and all strangers, to the number of 70,000, were everywhere put to the sword without distinction, and the Britons, by rendering the war thus bloody, seemed determined to cut off all hopes of peace or composition with the enemy. But this cruelty was revenged by Suetonius in a great and decisive battle where 80,000 of the Britons are said to have perished, and Boudicea herself, rather than fall into the hands of the enraged victor, put an end to her own life by poison. Nero, soon after, recalled Suetonius from a government where, by suffering and inflicting so many severities, he was judged improper for composing the angry and alarmed minds of the inhabitants. After some interval, Cerealis received a command from Vespasian and by his bravery propagated the terror of the Roman arms. Julius Frontinus succeeded Cerealis both in authority and in reputation, but the general who finally established the dominion of the Roman in this island was Julius Agricola, who governed it in the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, and distinguished himself in that scene of action. This great commander formed a regular plan for subduing Britain and rendering the acquisition of useful to the conquerors. He carried his victorious arms northwards, defeated the Britons in every encounter, pierced into the inaccessible forests and mountains of Caledonia, reduced every state to subjection in the southern parts of the island, and chased before him all the men of fiercer and more intractable spirits who deemed war and death itself less intolerable than servitude under the victors. He even defeated them in a decisive action which they fought under Galgacus, their leader, and having fixed a chain of garrisons between the friths of Clyde and Forth, he thereby cut off the ruder and more barren parts of the island and secured the Roman province from the incursions of the barbarous inhabitants. During these military enterprises, he neglected not the arts of peace. He introduced laws and civility among the Britons, taught them to desire and raise all the conveniences of life, reconciled them to the Roman language and manners, instructed them in letters and science, and employed every expedient to render those chains which he had forged both easy and agreeable to them. The inhabitants, having experienced how unequal their own force was to resist that of the Romans, acquiesced in the dominion of their masters and were gradually incorporated as a part of that mighty empire. This was the last durable conquest made by the Romans, and Britain, once subdued, gave no further inquietude to the victor. And Britain, once subdued, gave no further inquietude to the victor. Caledonia alone defended its barren mountain, and by the contempt which the Romans entertained for it, sometimes infested the more cultivated parts of the island by the incursions of its inhabitants. The better to secure the frontiers of the empire, Adrian, who visited this island, built a rampart between the river Tyne and the frith of Solway. Lollius Urbicus, under Antonius Pius, erected one in the place where Agricola had formerly established his garrisons. Severus, who made an expedition into Britain and carried his arms to the most northern extremity of it, added new fortifications to the wall of Adrian. And during his reigns of all the Roman emperors, such a profound tranquility prevailed in Britain that little mention is made of the affairs of that island by any historian. The only incidents which occur are some seditions or rebellions of the Roman legions quartered there, and some usurpations of the imperial dignity by the Roman governors. The natives, disarmed, dispirited, and submissive, had lost all desire and even idea of their former liberty and independence. The natives, disarmed, dispirited, and submissive, had lost all desire and even idea of their former liberty and independence.